We're Compound Everything. We talk money, markets, and investing. And today we are covering a lecture that Charlie Munger gave in 1994.
Yeah, it's called The Art of Stock Picking. So I think the way we'll framework this is, it's quite a lengthy speech. It's something to the tune of 18 pages. So we're going to condense it down to the things that really jumped out at us. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom there. I mean, if you want to read the speech yourself, I would highly encourage you to do it. But if you don't, these are our takeaways.
In fact, it would be better for them to just read the speech than to listen to us.
I think let's not shortchange ourselves. I think we have a few insights to add to what he said. Maybe not insights to add, but maybe more things that we took away from and extrapolated from what he said. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it.
So it's called The Art of Stock Picking, but essentially it's a breakdown of mental models. And then he takes those mental models and he uses them in stock picking. And so at the beginning he talks about how math and physics, essentially, those mental models are like the best, most concrete mental models because they never change.
No, math is math, physics is physics.
And how everyone should have them. And they're not that complicated, pretty much. You just need to know like the basics. He always says like the basic algebraic formulas from high school.
That's right.
And whatnot. And then he says after math and physics of importance is biology and physiology. And then he says thirdly, it's psychology and microeconomics.
Yes.
And those are the mental models that he kind of focuses in on this speech.
Yeah.
But he says you should have a baseline of the other four that I mentioned. And he said those are the most important, and yet it's the psychological mental models that people tend to get hung up on, which we've talked about a lot.
We've just covered a lot of that.
But Munger does an excellent job of taking those mental models and applying it to stock picking. So let's just start talking about what jumped out at us and what we can take away as self-taught investors.
Yeah. He spends quite a bit of the talk going through economies of scale. So economies of scale is a very powerful force, I guess, in the business world. And he talks about advantages and disadvantages of economies of scale that really jumped out at me. And so I think he mentions like 6 or 7 advantages of economy of scale. I'm going to read these so I don't miss any. And we'll kind of discuss a little bit through them as we go through. So first one is informational advantage, social proof, cost reductions, geometry, overwhelming dominance of one firm, and specialization.
So that's 6.
So
I
that's
counted
6.
while you were
Okay, great. Yeah. Good. So, I mean, and these are not all categories per se, and he doesn't list them. I just kind of took these out as I was reading the article. As I was like, oh, he talks about this, and this is another one. So what are these exactly? So an informational advantage, he uses the example, for instance, of having an economy of scale so large that you are just well known. So he uses the example of Wrigley's chewing gum versus another one called Glotz chewing gum.
I've never heard Glotz, but
but you've heard of Wrigley's.
I don't even know if that exists in Canada.
I haven't a clue.
I can't either.
Right. The point is, if you have a chewing gum like Wrigley's, and then you have another chewing gum on the shelf, and you know it's maybe a dime cheaper, is the example he uses. Which one are you going to put in your mouth? Well, you're going to pick the one you know, right?
Yeah, as long as the price isn't such a substantial amount, you're going to pick the one.
I mean, it's chewing gum, right? So unless there's a huge price advantage, you're probably going to go with the one you know.
And
so
that being said, sometimes the price advantage does make it better, and that's why it has that dominant position. Because
that's correct.
We tried the Dollarama, which is like a Dollar General store in Canada.
I forgot about
we tried the Mars bar version because it was like 80 cents.
Meteor or
something, and it tastes like nothing. It wasn't gross, but it was like we were eating nothing.
Yeah.
And Mars is not, I mean, it is in a percentage wise quite a bit more than 80 cents here.
Yes.
But when people are thinking dollar value, I don't know, it's like $1.25.
Sure.
So it was actually worth that though.
Yes.
Right? So you have the idea of it being familiar.
Yeah.
But then when you go down just a step, there was a definite difference.
There's a definite quality difference between the name brand Mars and Meteor or whatever the heck it was.
The Dollarama version.
The Dollarama version. So another advantage he gives is social proof. So social proof is essentially where, we've talked fairly extensively about this, social proof and whatnot, is people like to be doing what other people are doing, and people like to rely on people who have kind of proof behind them, for instance. So the example he gives is we all like to kind of be seen doing what others do, for instance. And that can come into force with name brands and things like that. So when you get economies of scale, they lend themselves to social proof as well. As the bigger a company gets, the more advantage they get in that respect.
So social proof is an interesting one because no one wants to admit that they are a crowd follower, but everyone is a crowd follower. So I recently just got back from volunteering at a children's camp in the kitchen. And as people who have been watching us for a while, everyone knows I watch Feet. And I watch Feet because I love to invest in shoe companies, which is funny because Buffett's biggest mistake was Dexter Shoe.
That's correct. Yes.
Anyways, everyone and their dog, well, there were no dogs at camp, but everyone was wearing Crocs. It didn't matter if it was the 8-year-old camper or the 50-year-old in the kitchen. Everyone had at least one pair of Crocs.
Yes.
And it's like, why? They're not exactly nice shoes, and honestly, everyone says they're comfortable, but they give me shin splints.
Right, they do, yeah.
Yeah, but I still
and blisters without socks.
Yeah, but I still wear them.
Yeah.
Why? Because we're all influenced by the crowd, whether we want to be or not.
Well, and do you want to be the person wearing the knockoffs?
Yeah, no.
No. You really don't.
And I'm invested in the company, so there's like a dual idea there for me. But the other thing, too, is my sister-in-law sent a picture of her children who are still young and very, very adorable. And it was at a birthday party, and her kids and all the other kids at the party were all wearing colorful Birkenstocks. I don't know if they were real Birkenstocks or from Superstore, but every kid had a different color. And even with our children, we'll make sure they're wearing what the other children are wearing. And I don't even think we're totally aware that we do this, but we all do it.
Yeah. And that's one of the advantages of economy of scale. So go back to the Crocs example again. You don't want to be the person who's wearing dogs and not Crocs.
And in fact, we bought our kid dogs a while back, and when he was young, because we didn't want to buy Crocs, and he still talks about how he owned dogs and not Crocs.
Parent fail.
Because they were so cheap.
Anyways, okay, moving on. So the other one he cites is geometry. So he cites if you're building a sphere or you're building a cube. The larger you go with a sphere or a cube or a container of sorts, the larger the cubic volume you're going to get. If you're constructing a steel building or steel sphere or something like that, you'll actually get more volume out of less steel. Less material, as you get larger. So it's an interesting, I don't know how that really applies to business per se, but it's interesting that you see it in the laws of nature, really in the laws of physics.
Yeah, it does apply to business, and this is where like understanding math in the easy stages helps, because with business, the bigger your network is, the less you have to pay per acquisition.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? So let's go back to Crocs, because I just mentioned it. The more people who are going to wear Crocs, the more people are going to wear Crocs, and it's going to cost the company less to advertise because people are naturally doing it on their own. So at first it cost a lot, right? Because they needed influencers and they needed to get these people on, and now it's just social proof.
Yeah.
Same with networking.
Yeah.
You start with a small group and all of a sudden, you have Facebook or you have Instagram.
So interestingly enough, he gives that example as another economy of scale advantage with TV stations and whatnot. So you had larger companies like Procter & Gamble and whatnot who were able to buy advertising.
Yes.
And, if you're a little guy developing your own little toothpaste, you can't.
It costs too much.
It costs too much.
The capital is not there to throw out your advertising.
But one thing that actually has changed that, you used the example of social media just now, and that's actually flipped that on its head a little, in my opinion, because now advertising, in a sense, isn't so broad. So No Bull Shoes, they're a CrossFit shoe company, and so No Bull Shoes, for them to buy a TV spot at the Super Bowl would probably be impossible.
Yes.
Right? But they could buy a spot on Instagram. And they have
social proof because they have good athletes.
That's right.
So people like me, they're not super well known.
No.
But it's enough of a niche that I'm like, oh yeah, I know them.
But they can, in a sense, buy advertising space and compete with a larger shoe company like Nike, for instance. Now that the social media platforms like Meta have come out, Google, same thing. So it's, in a sense, democratized that a little bit and taken a little bit of that advantage away, in my opinion.
And actually, one company that really used that to their advantage was Elf Cosmetics. Yes. They really were great at using TikTok in particular, but other social media platforms. And they've been a behemoth recently in the makeup industry. And when you talk to younger people, like Elf is they have like a cult following now. And they were able to do that because of social media.
That's right. So it's democratized that part of things a little bit and taken a little of that edge off of off that competitive advantage that was there for economies of scale,
100%.
in my opinion. The second last one is overwhelming dominance of one firm. So essentially what he's saying there is there's certain industries that tend to lead itself towards having one firm or one company just dominate that industry. So one of the areas that tended to drift towards this specialization of one firm was newspapers. And you could kind of see how this would happen. The higher the readership, then the advertisers would be drawn there, at which point they could probably afford to pay better journalists, which leads to better stories, which leads to more purchasing on the part of readers, which leads to more advertising. So it's this positive flywheel effect. And so you can see how one firm would probably be able to put other smaller firms out of business, because who wants to buy advertising in the second best newspaper? Yeah. So the last one he mentions is specialization. Specialization is essentially where a company gets so specialized that they get into a niche that no one else wants to occupy. And the example he uses is Motocross Magazine. He said their newspaper just got the pants beaten out of them because motocrossers love this magazine.
And niche is really, I hate that word because it's so overused, but that is really a big thing in, again, social media. If you actually think about it, social media has almost disrupted everything that you've said. But niche is really that's like a buzzword in social media, right? Yeah. What's your niche? But it's gotten to the point where you can find other people who like the most obscure things that you like. Yeah.
Well, and he used the example of, and going back to what you said before, just these mental models. And one of the mental models he uses is ecology. And so he cites, certain organisms have adapted themselves to live in such a kind of narrow ecosystem, they just thrive there. And so it works the same way in business. Some businesses are created and live in this area that's just so small and so specialized, and they just thrive.
And they do well.
And they do well.
Yeah, and the thing is, a business really is a living organism. It really is living, and you can see it. It has life cycles, and it acts very much like a living organism. And that mental model has actually helped me find good businesses. Yeah. Is thinking of it as a life and thinking of it as a living being has really kept me from taking some bad positions and helped me find some good ones.
Well, just like any living being, it needs care. It needs to be nurtured and whatnot in order to continue to thrive in its environment.
Like they say, if a child makes it past a certain age, generally around 1.
Yes.
They have a good chance of continuing on to 2 and 3.
That's a good point.
And then they say if a human in general makes it to 40, chances of them living till 70 or 80 are pretty high.
Sure, yeah.
And I have found that to be true in business.
Yeah.
If they make it past a certain stage, they'll probably last longer. But then at the same time, once a business gets to 80 or 90, you kind of start seeing younger or middle-aged companies come in and take them out, and businesses do die.
That's
older
right.
businesses. And so just the idea of a business being an organism is a super helpful mental model when deciding on where to put your money.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So Munger also lists several disadvantages of economies of scale, places where this can kind of bite you in the butt. And I'll just list these and whatnot. I won't discuss them too much. But in a sense, with the economies of scale, a company can get too big. They can't narrowly specialize. So, for instance, Berkshire got murdered by a small publication when they owned a newspaper business. A large size can compromise efficiency.
Oh, yeah.
You can get bureaucracy that gets in there, and that kills companies.
And bureaucracy that's where Walmart killed Sears.
That's right. That's precisely what happened. And then you get dysfunctional behavior.
Yeah. He talks about that a little bit with incentives.
Yes.
Did you catch that where he talked about FedEx and they were trying all these things with airports and how do they move more packages and all this, and nothing was working.
Yeah.
And then they decided to change the pay from hourly to shift.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it fixed everything.
Yeah. So the way I understood it is that once the employees for that shift got done their tasks, then they got to leave.
Yeah.
So if it took them 6 hours, then they got to go home. Yeah. If their shift was still 8 hours, but they got paid for the full 8. That's a big incentive.
Yeah. So
you want to get your work done.
Yeah. So when I say paid by shift, that's what I mean. So once they're, it was over, they could leave. Right?
Fantastic.
Yeah. But incentives work, and I think Buffett was the same person who talked about bad incentives.
Yes.
Show me the incentives and I'll show you the behavior kind of idea. And I know Wells Fargo, I think, fell into the bad incentives. So that was something that it was just very briefly mentioned in however many pages this document was and however long the speech was. But I was like, oh, that's interesting. Incentives always matter.
That's right. They matter big time.
Yeah, they matter in business. They matter in families. They matter in citizenship. They just always matter.
That's right.
So circling back to technology, one thing Charlie Munger says is technology is important, but you have to figure out when it helps you and when it hinders you. But the bigger thing about technology that caught my attention was we're always told, and when we started investing in our own, we kind of really did some deep dives into other people who followed Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, because value investing just resonated with our personalities. And one thing that we heard over and over is how they didn't like tech stocks, and it just stopped there. Right? Oh, Warren Buffett doesn't invest in tech stocks because they cannibalize themselves. Oh, they don't. Berkshire Hathaway doesn't like tech stocks because they have to destroy themselves in order to keep going.
Yeah.
But Charlie Munger in 1994, so this is even like way pre-AI frenzy.
This is 30 years ago.
Yeah, this is before the .com. Yeah. But like this is a while back. He said, he's like, yes, Berkshire Hathaway, or me and Buffett, we don't do tech stocks because we're not good at it.
Yeah.
But he said, if you understand it, you should be doing tech stocks. It's not that they were anti-tech, they just knew that wasn't their circle of competence. And I've never heard anyone come out and say that they actually endorse it as long as you can understand it. I've never once heard someone say it, but it was in this speech. And maybe I'll just read the quote.
Read the quote, yeah.
Some of you may find opportunities surfing along in the new high-tech fields, the Intels, the Microsofts, and so on. The fact that we don't think we're very good at it and have pretty well stayed out of it doesn't mean that it's irrational for you to do so. So with that, he talks about surfing, and surfing just means like these companies that come in kind of first to market, and they're really good companies with really good managers, and you can kind of see it, and it's within your circle of competence, and they essentially ride the wave. Yep. So surfing is a mental model that he loves. The reason they don't use it even outside of tech is because he says in this speech that they just got too big.
Yes.
Because small, he says, get them small and get them while they're little. Yes. Well, you can't do that when you're running hundreds of billions of dollars.
No,
it doesn't move. It doesn't make sense.
No, you end up acquiring the whole company.
Right. So that being said, I wouldn't necessarily say for a small investor that Berkshire Hathaway is great in copycatting actual positions. They're great in copying philosophies and understanding of the market, but because they're so big, to copycat their positions, you would take away the advantage you have as a small investor.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. One other thing that he mentioned in this speech that really resonated with me is how he concludes that the stock market is a lot like the pari-mutuel system. And effectively, it's a lot like horse betting in a sense. So horse betting, if you've ever done it, is a game of odds. So you have let's say you have 8 horses running, and you have a jockey that weighs this much, and the horse typically runs this fast over the quarter mile, and so on and so forth. And people will place bets on these horses depending on what they think is going to be the odds of this horse winning. And as they place bets, the odds end up changing. And so what may be the favorite horse to win may not pay out all that much in a sense.
And the pari-mutuel system is not super efficient.
It's not super efficient.
Yeah.
And so it's based on, if you have maybe more information than the other people betting, then you can make that work to your advantage.
Yeah.
And essentially what he says is, in this scenario, if you can make it work for you, then if you find a time where you have an advantage, informational advantage, then bet big. Bet big. Yeah.
He did say too that he knows very few people who are successful in a pari-mutuel system, and he said every single person he knows who has been successful in the pari-mutuel system rarely ever places a bet.
That's right.
And then he goes on to compare it to the stock market. And I really took this away because he said this over and over, but particularly in this portion where he compares the stock market to the pari-mutuel system. And he said, you're only going to have a few great opportunities in your lifetime, right? So you think about the successful pari-mutuel bettors, they waited for a big inefficiency. There was something just so ridiculous with that particular race that they knew that they should bet. And when they bet big. Yeah. And he said it's not, when those opportunities come,
the odds just didn't make sense.
The odds don't make sense. And he said that sometimes, like, it's very difficult and these opportunities don't come often. So just don't do anything. Yeah. But when they do come along, like, bet big.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing about the stock market in comparison to that is you can see obviously when there's clear winners in terms of certain industries. So think of NVIDIA or something like that. I mean, they're the clear winner right now in chips and whatnot. Yep. But they're priced such that, does it make sense for us as investors to bet on them?
And that's where he actually used an example. He said, the market's like the pari-mutuel system, and he uses IBM and a rail. And he says, you're looking at a railroad company and it's 1/3 book.
Yes.
And you're looking at IBM. Now, IBM in 1994 is not the IBM we know today. And it's 6 times book. Right? And he was like, that all makes sense until you throw the price in.
That's
and
right.
then all of a sudden the price makes it complicated. And he said, and that's why it's like the pari-mutuel system.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's like, I don't understand why people say the market is efficient.
Yes.
Right? And that's exactly what you're saying.
So one thing that really jumped out at me that I didn't know while reading this was obviously Ben Graham was investing in the 1930s. That's when he kind of cut his teeth and he developed the whole value investing framework. And at that time, Charlie Munger said that wheat prices were trading at 600-year lows.
That's crazy.
When adjusted for inflation. So, which is just mind-blowing.
Imagine wheat dropping to 600-year lows in
like
today.
That's unfathomable.
Yeah.
Like it'd be the same price as it was in the 1400s.
That's crazy. Yeah.
So that's when Ben Graham was cutting his teeth essentially and developing this framework for value investing. So why talk about that? Well, at that point, a lot of businesses were just getting hammered, and so what Charlie Munger said is Ben Graham went around with his Geiger counter and found things that were trading at below working capital, and he'd buy those businesses, and then eventually they'd kind of pop up, and then he'd sell them when they became fairly valued.
He made a point to say that the capital would go to the shareholders at
That's
that
right.
time in history.
Yeah, and at that time in history, then the capital would go to the shareholders. So basically,
if they went under,
or they decide to close the business, they would just close the business, and the working capital was returned to the shareholders, and essentially the workers lost their jobs, and that was it. But things change.
Yes.
And so that's the value investing, where value investing was born, was in that 1930s era. So we don't really see that so much anymore. It's very difficult to find businesses trading at below their working capital, firstly. And then secondly, if you do find them, then what happens if the business is liquidated? Is it that easy anymore? Does all that money get returned to the shareholders and whatnot? Probably not.
They restructure, they do this, they do that.
Right.
Yeah,
So
very different.
So it's very different now. So
the banking system's different.
The banking systems, a lot of things are very different now than they were when Ben Graham developed the value investing framework. The other thing is, Ben Graham tried to develop, as a teacher, he tried to develop a framework that anyone could use. And so,
which makes sense because he really wanted other people to be able to do this.
That's correct. And so he was developing kind of harder rules that people could follow and be successful. And so from that standpoint, because we'll say the macroeconomic environment has changed and regulatory environment in a sense has changed and whatnot, can you apply those same hard principles? It may be more difficult. I'm sure if you look hard enough, Monish Pabrai would say, if you're looking for stocks that are trading at nets, then you can find them. You just got to look hard. But
he finds a lot of them not in America.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
You got to be willing to go elsewhere.
Yeah, because it's difficult now.
It's difficult
to do that type of investment.
That's correct. That's where Warren and Charlie kind of diverted and said, okay, we made our first, a few $100 million doing this kind of investing, a few $100 million. Yeah. But the bulk of it was made buying great businesses at fair prices. And he said that they bought businesses at valuations that probably would have made Ben Graham sick, essentially.
And they noticed that you couldn't do what Ben Graham did because the country had changed. Yeah. The economics had changed.
And their business had changed.
Yes, you're right.
They got bigger.
Yeah, and so what did you take away from that? Because to me that was a great little portion of this lecture.
Yeah, I took away that I think you need to change your investing framework as you're getting more successful, whatnot, and your bankroll's growing. At that point, you may be not getting the same opportunities anymore. So I think the value investing principles obviously apply. So the principles of value will always apply, but the way you apply them may be different.
Yeah, and it made me think of Li Lu, and I always say this on this podcast, that it is really difficult to find a great company with a PE of 30 or less. And that was one of those aha moments for my own investing journey or whatever you want to call it. Because, I was in more of the Ben Graham camp. I was never totally there because I never did nets and stuff. But, I wanted what Manish says, I want a P of 1.
Right.
Right. Well, you're not going to get Monster Beverage or Lululemon for a PE of 1.
No, that's
right?
just not going to happen.
Like, that's not going to happen. So I was trying to figure out, like, I wanted wonderful companies, but I wanted them at a deep value price.
Yeah.
But you need to do wonderful companies at a fair price.
Yeah.
And then Lilu jumps on and says, you're not really going to find a wonderful company with a PE of less than 30. But sometimes you do. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say there's actually a couple of wonderful companies right now with very low PEs in comparison to that 30.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Well, one of your best investments was one that you bought with a PE of 4 or 5, which was Crocs.
Yes.
And you referenced that earlier today.
I still think Crocs is there. I'm watching it because, like I said, trends change. But I really think that their CEO is a great capital allocator. And, I mean, time will tell.
Yeah. So from that standpoint, I think, again, the principles of value investing will always work. But how you work them may be different.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to be flexible in terms of your investment practice.
Yeah.
Is what I really took away from that part of the lecture.
Yeah, you have to be flexible and you have to be honest. And I guess just to wrap up, the way he wraps up his lecture, so we'll wrap it up here with this, is the reason why money managers, and he talks a little bit about how the best thing to do is nothing, but money managers do too much, and well, they have to do too much because you'd be like, why on earth am I paying this guy if he's doing nothing?
That's right.
So, there's that whole dichotomy there. But he says a lot of reasons why money managers don't outperform the market is because they're actually not willing to look at the psychological issues within their own person, within their own mind, and deal with them. And they're kind of like, I think he calls it psychological denial.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so again, we go back to this. It seems like every great investor is willing to step back and say, what are my psychological biases when I sit down at that computer and I'm going to hit buy or sell?
That's right. I think you have to look back at that. Yeah. I know you said we're wrapping up, but there's one more thing that jumped out at me that I wanted to share, and that is about management. And this is what he says about management. He says, occasionally you'll find a human being who is so talented that he can do things that ordinary skilled mortals can't. And he said, I would argue that Simon Marx, who was second generation in Marks and Spencer of England, was such a man. Patterson was such a man at National Cash Register, and Sam Walton was such a man. He says you can identify these people, and he goes on about Jack Welch as well. He said he was just an amazing CEO for GE. And so it makes me think, who are those people now? I would argue in a sense that Elon Musk is that one of those.
But we're already kind of past the get them small, get them while they're little.
Yeah, that's one of the things he mentions is try and find one of these people who is not a mere mortal, who can do things that no mere mortal can, and get on that bandwagon early. Yeah. And so I would say Elon Musk is one of those people, but again, maybe that ship is kind of sailed.
I mean, maybe not. Who knows? Time will tell.
Well, who knows?
Maybe
Jensen Huang would be another one in my opinion. Mark Zuckerberg would be another one. Jeff Bezos, we had talked about a little earlier. And so just finding people like that and putting your bets with them, I think you'll probably do well.
And I mentioned this to you, and we're going to look into him because we don't know, but right now we're wondering if the CEO of SoFi is that.
Yeah, I just watched an interview with him this morning, actually. He seems like a pretty wise CEO.
And he's already disrupting the bank industry. And so I think we'll do a little bit more digging on him. But because Zuckerberg, everyone knows these guys are great capital allocators already. And everyone knows that in retrospect. Like, we're already talking about, like, oh, yeah, you could have seen it. But now you want to find where Elon Musk was 20 years ago. You want to find the Mark Zuckerberg 10 years ago. Yeah. So
I think at that point, it's just about getting deep in the company and trying to see how these people have executed.
Yes.
So have they said, have they had a pattern of having good ideas and then executing on those good ideas and disrupting and whatnot? So I think if you've found that and you found a CEO has zeal for his business or her business, then I think you got something. Yeah. And I think just on the flip side, he also mentions, like, at the end of the day, management matters, but the quality of the company matters more. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And so if you have a great company and they run into a really bad CEO, they can get rid of him and bring in someone new. Yeah. And that is really what matters. Yeah. That is what matters. And we're seeing a few companies have not great CEOs right now, and maybe it's a buying opportunity because they're still really great companies. They just need better leadership. Yeah. So I think we'll wrap up there. Yeah. Do you have anything else to say? I don't. Okay. So you can find this podcast on pretty much every platform now. And if you can like and subscribe this video, that really helps our channel.